Dr. J. Scott Turner. His latest book is called Purpose and Desire from 2017. He's the Emeritus Professor of Biology at the State University of New York, the project director on science-related issues for the National Association of Scholars. He's a physiologist by training, but with a deep interest in the interface of physiology with evolution, ecology, and adaptation. Um, he's a prolific author of peer-reviewed scientific articles and books, which are available on his website. And we're very happy to hear from him today and feel, you know, we're very much grateful that he's participating in our conference today. So thank you.
Well, let me let me just say that I'm very grateful for being here. I've been enjoying the presentations I've been seeing from a variety of different perspectives. So let me begin just by making sure my screen can be shared here. I think this is it here. So I'm going to share this, and you should be able to see my screen now, my presentation.
Yes, you can.
Great. Okay. Let me just get everything else in place here. There we are. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. That'll enable me to skip through a lot of the first things that I've mentioned in my presentation. Thank you very much for laying the groundwork on that. As was said, I'm a physiologist. That's basically the science of how life works. And the motivating question throughout most of my career was what the science of physiology, that is how life works, has to say about the science of evolution. And this has taken me on a really rather long journey and into some fairly heterodox thoughts about both evolution and about life. I've outlined that journey in the 3 books whose covers that you see here, starting with The Extended Organism in 2000, followed by The Tinkerer's Accomplice in 2007, and ending, as we said, with the book Purpose and Desire. The title of this book, by the way, is a play on Jacques Monod's very famous book, Chance and Necessity. Okay. So what I'd like to do is it's been a fairly complicated journey. So what I'd like to do is to try to make some sense of it for you. And of course, I also want to credit those that have arrived at pretty much the same conclusions as where I am now, often many, many years before me. And of course, this includes many of the participants in our conference today. Okay, now, as far as my scientific career goes, I wish I could say there was a plan, but there wasn't one. Mostly, I spent my career kind of stumbling around through a series of conundrums, and I'll try to retrace that journey here. But conundrums are a good thing because as conundrums do, one leads primarily to more conundrums, and we always end up ultimately that ultimate conundrum of just what is it that life is. Okay, so the first conundrum, I'm going to start right here. What is this thing anyway that you see here? And this is a mound built by a group of termites that we find in southern Africa. The termites that build them were the objects of most of my research career. These mounds are quite spectacular. They can reach several meters in height. They are the result of termites transporting hundreds of kilograms of soil up into the mound from below ground each year. And the curious thing about these mounds is that they are not the residence for the termites. The termites don't actually live in the mound. They live in a colony that's itself situated quite deep underground. And so this raises the question, why is it that the termites go to all the trouble of building this thing? Now, what attracted my interest is that these mounds exhibit a lot of attributes that normally one would ascribe to living things. They have a functionality. Basically, they behave basically as wind-driven lungs for the colony. They're also adaptable. They can change shape depending upon circumstances in some fairly predictable ways. And they exhibit an interesting conformity between function and the structure needed to effectively carry out that function. And to use a loaded word here, this means that they are actually designed. And so here's the conundrum. Is this thing a heap of soil just sitting there, or is it as alive as the termites that build it? And what I have decided is that yes, it is just as much alive as the termites that build it. What we're looking here is what I call an extended organism, and let me just give some background to this. The organism, as we've heard several times here, is an obvious unit of life. I'm an organism, so are all of you listening today, and so are the termites that build this mound. But organisms can exist on many scales, and one way of thinking about social insects like these is to describe them as so-called superorganisms. The reason for this is because the colonies exhibit a collective behavior that bears some remarkable resemblances to the behavior of organisms themselves as we conventionally understand them. These things coordinate their behaviors, these swarms coordinate their behaviors to exhibit many organism-like qualities like coherency, adaptability, and so forth. And I have to say that the superorganism is not a new idea. It's a pretty well accepted idea. It's been around since the end of the 18th century. But what I suggested in this book is that the organism also has to include the environment in which the organisms live. And the conclusion that I've drawn from this is the environment is not simply where the organism lives. The environment is actually also an active participant in the life of the organism. And I like to say that organisms and environment are actually engaged in a conspiracy of sort. In a short, they breathe together, which is the literal meaning of the term. And this extension of the organism to the environment comes about by active manipulation of the external environment. Now, the mound of Macrotermes is a pretty dramatic example of an extended organism in work, but in fact, the biosphere is actually rife with other examples, and a lot of these are outlined in this book. Okay, on to the next conundrum. Now, I'm a physiologist, and this means that the concept of homeostasis is a central aspect of our thinking about how physiology works. And excuse me, this gentleman here is Claude Bernard. He was a 19th century French physiologist. Every physiologist knows who he is because he's regarded as the founder of the modern science of physiology. And one of his core concepts was the concept of homeostasis, which you see down below on the page there. And I bring up homeostasis as a conundrum because it's perhaps the most misunderstood and arguably trivialized concept in modern biology. Now, usually we learn about Claude Bernard through a famous aphorism of his, and here it is. It's in quotes there: "The steadiness of the internal environment is the condition for a free and independent life." And our modern interpretation of Bernard's thinking and of homeostasis is to treat homeostasis as a regulation of an internal environment, which is mediated by various kinds of regulatory machines that give rise to it. And for lack of a better term, I call this the cybernetic interpretation of Bernard's thinking, kind of like the organization of a thermostat, for example. Excuse me, but if you delve into Bernard's writings, as well as just the simple grammatic structure of this aphorism, it becomes clear pretty quickly that the cybernetic interpretation of homeostasis has the concept exactly backwards. The cybernetic interpretation says that homeostasis is the outcome of the operation of regulatory machines. But if you look at the aphorism, you can see that the predicate is homeostasis, that is the steadiness of the internal environment. to the outcome, which is the free and independent life. So this makes homeostasis, and actually Bernard himself, a kind of small v vitalist, if you will. In other words, he didn't believe in vital spirits or vital essences, but rather he looked at life as a unique phenomenon in the universe, different from any other, and this meant that the unique nature of life was to be found in the organization of life itself. Okay, and the thing that made life unique was this phenomenon of homeostasis. That is, it's a fundamental property of life. It's not something that can be regarded as the outcome of some kind of subsidiary set of mechanisms. Okay, the next conundrum that we had to deal with is this phenomenon of adaptation, which is actually a manifestation of homeostasis in some interesting ways. So let's look at what adaptation actually is. The literal meaning of it is, excuse me, tendency to aptitude, and what do we mean by that? Let's go through that piece by piece. First of all, we start with the notion that adaptation is actually a manifestation of the distinctiveness of living systems. They are adaptable. They change form and function in ways that fit them to live well in an environment, that is, to produce an aptitude for living in that environment. Now, environments, of course, change from time to time. They vary from place to place, which we could designate as circumstance. And adaptation comes about when form and function vary to conform to the demands that environments make on living things. In other words, it's tending to apt function. That's the nature of adaptation. Now, there's a difficult question at the heart of that. For adaptation to work, the living system somehow has to know what form and function it's supposed to take on. And we don't really have a good answer for that. This implies a kind of self-knowledge of what the organism wants to be, if you will, or intends to be. And of course, this property has been brought up by several of the speakers that we've heard from so far. Now, our modern concept of adaptation is as distorted, if you will, as the modern concept of homeostasis. And let me just outline the standard view of what adaptation is and how it comes to be. Namely, it's that adaptation is something that's specified by a collection of what we might call apt function genes, that's the result of natural selection of apt function genes. As we'll see a little bit later, that's a bit of an empty tautology, doesn't really explain very much. And so if we take a physiological approach to this, we can start treating adaptation not as something that's specified by a group of genes that specify apt function, but as an expression of homeostasis. And that was the main theme of my second book here, The Tinkerer's Accomplice. And adaptation is manifest tangibly in the property of what we might call biological design. The structure of bones, for example, conforms pretty closely to what you would expect a mechanical engineer would produce them to be. And of course, there's no mechanical engineer doing this, but nevertheless, the bones conform to certain design principles for cantilever beams, and that's kind of an impressive thing and demands explanation. And so what I'm saying here is that the standard view is another view of what I call the erroneous inversion. The specification of adaptation as by apt function genes is an empty concept. We only identify apt function genes by their ability to produce apt function, and that doesn't really tell us very much. And so we turn back to Bernard's interesting inversion. Is mechanism actually the outcome of adaptation. Is it adaptation that comes first and mechanism that trails along behind? And I think there's a credible case to be made that, in fact, that is the case. Now, I want to introduce here a concept that I call an adaptive interface. This is central to our means of describing how mechanism adaptation can actually stream from homeostasis. And at its simplest, the cell membrane is the ultimate adaptive interface. And what adaptive interfaces do is they basically partition environments. In this case, it partitions an internal intracellular environment from an external extracellular environment. Now, the membrane is not just a container. It's actually quite a dynamic system. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here. This is a cartoon of how regulation of salt and water composition is maintained. Basically, what we're looking at here is the cell membrane actually manages actively flows of matter and energy across it, in this case, water, sodium, and potassium ions, and so forth. And this is a cognitive system. The cell membrane has embedded in it a number of molecules that enables it to sense the conditions of the external environment. And what makes this an adaptive interface is that this can map the external environment onto a cognitive representation that exists within the cell. And this can be something as simple as a change in the catalytic milieu of the cell that tracks what's happening to the external environment. The end result of this is the cell adaptive interface manages fluxes of matter and energy across the interface in order to keep the cell operating in an integral manner. In other words, to sustain the cell itself through time. Now, of course, this means that adaptive interfaces are really the engines of this property of homeostasis. And when we talk about the extended organism, how this fits into it, this leads us to a rather startling conclusion. Let me build up to that. If you're managing fluxes of matter and energy across a cell membrane, anything you do to transport any kind of matter across the membrane, and this can be active or passive, simple conservation of mass says that you're going to change the environment not only inside the membrane, but also outside it as well. And the startling conclusion is this, that if you have homeostasis inside the cell, that's necessarily going to impose a kind of homeostasis outside the cell as well. In other words, we're talking about a phenomenon of what we might call extended homeostasis. Now, when we look at how organisms are organized, if you will, we see that adaptive interfaces can exist in a number of different categorizations. So, for example, groups of cells can organize themselves into coalitions that form sheets. These are called epithelia, and they're the basic building block of multicellular organisms. These adaptive interfaces can nest. Cells can nest within the internal environments created by epithelia, and these themselves can nest into tissues, organ systems, and organisms. But it doesn't stop there. That's not the ultimate form of adaptation. The extended organism idea presents no barrier to organisms entering into coalitions of superorganisms, and the reach of this kind of extended homeostasis can extend to ecosystems, to populations, indeed always, indeed up to the level of the biosphere. That's about its limit, and of course this leads us into another interesting concept, Gaia theory, which I believe Dennis Noble mentioned in his presentation et al. There's a counterintuitive idea at the heart of this. Textbooks of biology usually talk about the thermodynamics of life as the orderliness of the cell being bought at the expense of disorder in the environment. In other words, life is a fundamentally disordering phenomenon. But in fact, if you look at this through the lens of the extended organism and homeostasis, you can see that life is actually a profoundly ordering phenomenon in the universe. That, in other words, the biosphere is an orderly place, and it's orderly because of this phenomenon of homeostasis and extended organisms. Nevertheless, life exists in a physical world. There has to be some kind of a physical basis for that. Life cannot defeat the second law of thermodynamics, for example. But nevertheless, how do you reconcile that with this phenomenon of homeostasis, life having an intrinsic and inherent property that is independent of the physical world? All right, so let's delve into that a little bit. Just how is it that thermodynamics can be reconciled with this extended organism idea? And we start with the basic notion that life is really a so-called open thermodynamic system. That is, matter flows in a closed loop between living entities and the environment. In short, between orderly collections of matter and which are contained within organisms and disorderly collections of matter. And this means that life is an order producing, that is an entropy minimizing process of work in which the free energy that does the work ultimately dissipates as heat. And this is kind of the conventional way of talking about the thermodynamics of life as these cycles of matter flow across essentially adaptive interfaces. Each of these types of organisms represents a different kind of an adaptive interface, and a one-way flow of energy from free energy, in this case sunlight for the biosphere, dissipating ultimately at the end as heat. Now, I would like to argue that this really isn't a very good metaphor for thinking about the thermodynamics of life. Basically, when you talk about life, you're talking about a pool of low entropy that actually sits perpetually on a rather precarious thermodynamic perch. So, for example, open thermodynamic systems, of which the Earth is one, often exhibit some transient forms of orderliness. And what we can do is we can represent this as a kind of a standing wave, if you will, of low entropy that is powered by a stream of energy coming in from the sun. It amounts to about 128 petawatts or 128,000 terawatts streaming into the Earth all the time. And you don't need to have life to produce a certain degree of order. For example, this 128 petawatts does things like organize the orderly patterns of circulation of the atmosphere and the oceans, for example. This has obvious implications for weather and so forth. And so that's an example of the kind of standing wave of orderliness that exists in open thermodynamic systems frequently. And if we think about where life sits on that, globally, life consumes about 90 terawatts of energy that come of that 128 petawatts coming into the Earth, and it's the most orderly phenomenon on the Earth. And so, life can be thought of as riding along the uppermost part of this crest of orderliness. And I've just sort of colored in yellow boundary there to indicate where life sits, and it sits really on the crest of this wave, and ultimately it degrades down to equilibrium, as it does in any thermodynamic open thermodynamic system. Now, we can bring this in. If we look down on it from the top, then we can look at the organism as something like this. I've shaded it in blue. Life sits right up here at the crest of this standing wave of low entropy, and it channels in matter basically coming up along the backside of this crest right here, and then it's ordered into a pool of low entropy, which then automatically degrades to disorder as it slides down the crest of this wave. And so life sits up there kind of like a frothy crest on the surface of a wave. Now, this metaphor, I think, is useful because it enables us to think in interesting ways about concepts like homeostasis and the extended organism, for example. And we can do so by a thought experiment. Just like Einstein famously asked us to imagine riding along next to a photon at the speed of light, we can do something similar for this standing with the crest of this standing wave. You know, if we look out over a forest, for example, what we see is a collection of organisms, of trees and grass and birds and those kinds of things, and that's a perfectly sensible way to look at it. But thermodynamically, we're actually watching this kind of crackling crest of this thermodynamic wave going on through time. It's a standing wave. And so if we follow this crest through time, we can think about homeostasis and extended organisms in perhaps a more creative way. Okay, so in this case, I've illustrated this by zooming in on this yellow wave crest. An organism is basically the interface, and I've depicted this with this dark line right here. Each organism occupies a different form of this thermodynamic crest. Homeostasis basically is the maintenance of a particular shape of this front. That's what distinguishes one organism from another. And so an organism is really basically a homeostatic system that maintains the structure of this standing wave crust. Matter and energy are channeled into this, and this is where the extended organism comes in. It's basically a modification of the environment on the rising part of the crest to help channel matter and energy through the organism in such a way that it can persist even if conditions change on the other side of it, as it goes down to disorder or on the rise up to orderliness. And basically, you know, this metaphor is one way to express homeostasis, the organism and the extended organism. But there's another conundrum that's sitting at the heart of this, and that is related to the nature of the adaptive interface as a cognitive system. And where does cognition fit into basic principles or phenomena, attributes of life like intentionality and purposefulness? And one of the failings of the materialist approach to life that is typically undertaken right now, and many of the authors have suggested this, is that it doesn't really deal well with these attributes of life being an intentional and purposeful phenomenon. Okay, so this leads us into some deep questions about just what is it that is cognition, what's intentionality, and where does purpose come from? And you'll recognize this famous example from Descartes, and so we'll start there. If we ask just what cognition is, at its simplest, you're talking about the creation of a so-called mental world, which I've depicted with this pink geometric diagram up there. And at its most basic level, cognition creates a mental world that's a map of the outside real world, in quotes. And what is going on here, of course, is that the cognitive system, whatever that is, acts to ensure that there's some kind of conformity between the real world and the mental image of it. And if the real world changes, a good cognitive system should actually change the state of the mental world to bring it into conformity with what the senses are telling it about the real world. Okay, so that's only really half of what cognitive systems do, though, and we'll get into that in more detail momentarily. If you talk about these kinds of things right here, you're talking about a phenomenon that's called tracking. That is, the mental image tracks what's going on in the outside world. But adaptive interfaces and organisms also do work, and this is where the extended organism comes in. If, for example, you have a mental world that doesn't look like the real world, then there are engines at work that can actually bring the real world into conformity with the mental world. In other words, cognition really works both ways, and this is where intentionality and purposefulness comes in. So, for example, if there's a mental world that doesn't really correspond with what a sensory interface is telling the mind about what the real world is, then again, the cognitive map can be coupled to a motor interface that does work to bring the real world into conformity with the mental image of it. So it really works both ways. And that, I would argue, is the most basic definition of intentionality. And you can even extend this to the phenomenon of creativity. Now, mental images actually arise in a number of ways. You can have other cognitive engines. You can have them arising de novo, just from the activity of complex brains. And I would argue that complex brains are not limited to complex central nervous systems, by the way. There's lots of other examples of this that are more distributed. But again, you have this thing where this is being coupled to a motor interface that actually brings in to being an external world that had never existed before, except in this novel cognitive or mental representation of it. And so this is where creativity comes from. And you can generate these things with some fairly simple explorations of the adaptive interface. And of course, purpose comes in when the homeostasis of the living system is actually imposed upon the external environment as well as the internal environment. And this underscores the shortcomings of the cybernetic model for homeostasis. You can easily construct these things, but there's a difficult question that sits at the heart of it, which is not really answered adequately by nearly anyone. And that is, these kinds of cybernetic systems have a goal state around which they behave, but no idea of where the goal state comes from. And it's difficult to find these components in the living body. This is a kind of computation, if you will, this cybernetic model. And there's not even any evidence that brains act as computers. And this has been brought up a couple times in the presentations so far. All right, and now we come back to this other basic conundrum, which is, well, just what is life anyway? Is it just chemistry? Is it mechanism? Arguably, I would say no, that there's something else going on there. And I like to illustrate this with another little thought experiment, which is look at these two manifestations of energy flow, a cauliflower and a cumulus cloud. They have a number of similarities to one another. They're both puffy and white, for example, but as you delve deeply into the similarities between the two, you find that most of the things that are usually advanced as distinctive features of life, like order-producing thermodynamic systems, they obey fourth law thermodynamics, that is this transient production of orderliness. They have kind of a metabolism. They even have memories of sort. We come down to this basic question: what is it that makes the cauliflower different from the cumulus cloud? And the end result, if you delve into it deeply enough, is you end up with a conclusion that, well, the cauliflower actually wants to be a cauliflower in ways that the cumulus cloud cannot want to be a cumulus cloud. And so there's this distinctive nature of life that comes out. Now, getting into the philosophy of this introduces some concepts that don't really sit well in modern biology and modern science. And among them is a concept dating back to Aristotle. He called this his bios. I've put it out here in Greek letters, of course. And what Aristotle suggested was that the bios is actually the organism is actually the expression of its nature, and its nature Aristotle regarded as its bios. And this is a form of idealism. The bios in Aristotle's mind was an ideal toward which the organism strives. And one of the corollaries of that is that the organism's form and function may vary, but it varies according to a purpose and ways that sustain the bios that sits at the heart of the organisms themselves. Now, this is constitutes the missing goal state, in other words, from all these cybernetic approaches to homeostasis. It goes without saying that any form of idealism is frowned upon or looked upon skeptically by modern science, but it actually survives in some odd ways. Bernard's conception of homeostasis actually is the philosophical cousin to Aristotle's concept of the bios, and so it sits there cryptically, but it's there nevertheless. And I think that we need to be able to grapple with that essential purposefulness that sits at the heart of life. And what this says is that, mechanism probably isn't enough. And I'm not the only one here at this conference who has said this. And, maybe it's time to take another look at Aristotle's bios as an organizing philosophical principle of the science of life. Among other things, it introduces things akin to the concept of a soul, which we've already heard from others in this conference. This is fine for organisms and adaptability of organisms, but there's a big problem there, and that is that the bios is incompatible with the idea of evolution. Evolution has changed, the bios doesn't change. And so how do we reconcile that? Which brings us to this basic problem, which is in order for evolution to work in these kinds of frameworks, you have to have some means of heritability of adaptation. In other words, adaptation in an organism's lifetime has to somehow be transmitted onto subsequent generations. That's the only way that you can get evolution driven by adaptation. And this, of course, is August Weismann, who is the author of the famous Weismann barrier, which supposedly barred any transmission of a living organism's adaptations in its lifetime from being passed on to future generations. And this supposedly has ruled out the notion of heritable adaptation. The Weismann barrier yes? Did
You
you?
can just conclude in 5 minutes.
Yes, I will. I'm working on that. Yes. And adaptation is supposedly heritability of adaptation is supposedly impossible. But Barbara McClintock has been invoked a couple of times, starting with her. That's been a long slide towards exposing these kinds of barriers as mostly hokum. Adaptation is heritable across generations, and the question is what guides it. And of course, we've seen a fair number of examples of ways in which this heritable memory can work. It can work either through epigenetic markers. There's grammar and syntax that comes in. There's symbology in the form of symbiotics and semiotics and so forth. And this raises another fundamental question about that we have to address, which is what's the nature of heritable memory? And again, we come back to a distinction between genes and the phenotype. And genes really are kind of a form of what we might call object memory. It's a molecule, it's a memory token, and so forth. And it can vary only by mutation. Whereas if you look at the real phenomenon of memory, it's really a dynamic process. It's a kind of process memory. And what qualifies it as memory is how long the persistence can endure. And this means that heritable memory can be expanded widely. It doesn't have to exist in just genes. In fact, one of the things this does, and other people's work has done, is to dethrone the gene as as the sole repository of hereditary memory. There are lots of things that can carry hereditary memory. All that's needed is that its memory extends farther into the future than the lifetime of the organisms that have built it, and this means that heritable memory can exist in the form of culture, language. In the case of these termites, these bring about very large-scale modifications of the environment in such a way that it exceeds by far the lifespan of the termites that built it. And so this is heritable memory, and this is basically niche construction theory that I think a couple of people have mentioned as well. So all these things can be aspects of heritable memory. And I'll just wrap up with a couple of considerations of of what should be an appropriate philosophy of life. This is a little map that I've drawn for myself to show the development of Western philosophy over the past couple of thousand years. And I'd like to first blow up an assertion that I often hear made by people, which is that science is the liberation from philosophy. Well, that's nonsense. Science is philosophy. It's just a different kind of philosophy. And so the question is, we have a number of competing philosophies. We have the two, what I call purposeful philosophies here in terms of Aristotelianism and Platonism, and then you have the purposeless philosophy of atomism. And if you look at modern biology in terms of molecular biology, neo-Darwinism, and so forth, these are very much derived from the atomist purposeless notions of no purpose and mechanism and so forth. But if you look at evolution and those kind of things, they have actually been occupied by the purposeful philosophies for some time. So, for example, physiology and ontogeny are very much purposeful sciences, even though physiologists often don't like to admit it. And intelligent design is another one, but in this case, it's derived from basically a very strong Platonic thing. So, while molecular biology and Darwinism have told us a lot, there's a lot to be learned about life, ways to think about life in these kinds of philosophical this philosophical diversity, if you will. And it's going to be no secret that I will come down on Aristotelianism as the favored philosophy of life. And of course, this is going to face a fair bit of resistance. Most scientists are embedded in this purposeless philosophy of atomism. And when you introduce the concepts like this, and I'm sure everyone in this conference has experienced this, you're accused of being a vitalist, which is something of a dirty word. And so there's a great deal of cultural resistance to this. But I think that there's no way of actually talking about life coherently without bringing in a deliberately purposeful, cognitive-driven philosophy of life. And of course, others have said that you really cannot separate life from some conception of the mind. And this leads me to my final slide here, which is that if we think about the evolution of life, the relationship between physiology and evolution, there is no essential dividing line between them. Evolution, like life, is cognitively driven, it's purpose-laden, and it's driven by desire, and it's essentially cognitive thermodynamics. And for that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Dennis Noble just put a comment in the chat also.
I see that.
So if there are any questions from the audience, I know I have some things, but I'd like to wait because that would be selfish of me. So if anyone would like to say anything, please go ahead.
Well, I appreciate Dennis Noble's comment that yes, there's no way of escaping philosophy. I mean, why would you even want to escape philosophy in this? Because you know, philosophy of all stripes is just seeking to make sense of the world, and you know, science is one way to do it, and furthermore, science has a number of different philosophical inputs into it, and so this notion that science of life has to be molecular, has to be driven by mechanism and so forth. It's a very constrained way of thinking about life and doesn't really get you, well, it gets you a certain distance, pretty far actually, but you ultimately bump up against the limits of what that can do.
I'll go ahead and say a couple of things if that's all right with everybody. The first was you mentioned you were impressed with the design of bones in organisms. So the first thing that came to my mind was Georges Cuvier, the zoologist and naturalist born in 1769 and died in 1832. And then I saw at the end you actually mentioned his name in your map of philosophies. He, you know, 1769 to 1832, at that time, he was, I mean, revolutionary, holistic thinker. And he could, from a single bone, essentially, through his understanding of the necessity of the form of the bone, he could reconstruct an entire skeletal system, which was pretty amazing. So you mentioned that your favorite Aristotle's philosophy over the systems of philosophy. And one thing that our institute is presenting, one thing that Dr. Bhakti Madhavapuri is presenting, he's also in line with Aristotle's philosophy, and he's emphasizing Hegel's building upon Aristotle's philosophy. And in fact, Hegel in his Encyclopedia of Nature, in verse 370, the 370th paragraph, he mentions Cuvier's work in that regard. So, you know, we just humbly, you know, are suggesting scientists like yourself who like to think about these things, if they took a look at Hegel's philosophy, they may find it very enriching. And then two other points. One, you had your adaptive interfaces nest, where the top two were the ecosystem and the biosphere. And then you mentioned at that point, you know, the Gaia theory. And you mentioned, I think you mentioned the lack of mention in Gaia in Dennis Noble's presentation. So I just wanted to actually bring up a comparison with that adaptive interface nest with that inverted pyramid of purposiveness that Dennis Noble had. The top two categories there were the top, the sociotype, and then the next one, the ecotype. So you both mentioned ecosystem and ecotype as the second to top, whereas his was a sociotype, the top level, and then yours was a biosphere. So I wonder if there's room for discussion about, you know, the sociotype must definitely be there. And then beyond that, what is the relationship to the biosphere that integrates the human form of life with its capacity for reason, philosophy, science, art, religion, government, and integrated with life as a whole as it manifests in the biosphere.
Yeah. I actually think there's almost perfect agreement between what Dennis Noble has said and I. If I meant to say that Dennis did not believe in Gaia, I don't know. Maybe he does, and maybe he doesn't. But you know, to a physiologist like me, and to a physiologist like I know Dennis Noble to be, Gaia theory actually makes perfect sense to me as a physiologist. It makes perfect sense to me as an extension of homeostasis to the biosphere, and And so I'm in absolute agreement. If you're looking at the things that that drive evolution, it's really not so much from the bottom up. It's actually a conversation between sources of memory that have origins in molecules and so forth, but nevertheless are interpreted in ways that differ all the way up the scales of organization. And I absolutely agree with them that this interaction between environment and organism is actually crucial, and actually a neglected way of thinking about evolution that I think opens up the door to a much richer exploration of what evolution is, but an exploration of evolution as something that is actually totally contradictory to the Darwinian idea. And again, I'll let Dennis speak to this, but I think this is one of the most interesting developments that's been going on in the science of life right now. That is this expanded conception of evolution and the interaction of evolution with the way living things actually work. And I don't know if Dennis wants to chime in here, but I do want to address what you brought up about QVA and the role that or the place that QVA and thinkers like Lamarck have in our evolutionary thinking. But Dennis, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
Yes, I would like to come in if I may. Actually, in my triangular diagram towards the end, the ecotype was immediately below the sociotype. Now, you can argue about that. Maybe it should be the other way around. But I think Scott Gilbert and I are totally in agreement with this. The ecotype is itself a form of a living thing.
Yes.
Meaning that it has purpose. And you can see that in the interaction between organisms and the ecotype, because the organisms make the ecotype. It is part of the process by which the sociality occurs. So in one sense, you could say that those two levels in my triangular diagram are not really separate. They intermingle. But certainly we agree the ecotype is absolutely critical. And the way in which organisms interact with their sociotype, with their ecotype, is a critical part of their sociology.
Yes.
I remember it may have been Watson, who was the more absurd of the two, Watson and Crick, and he once said, it's molecules all the way down. The rest is sociology. My response was, yes, Jim, and sociology is where it's at.
And Watson is also the author of this infamous comment that there are no interesting questions left in biology that aren't molecular. So, which I thought was very short-sighted.
Well, one has just to laugh, doesn't one?
Yes.
If I may just ask, I think there's a lot of rich conversation that can happen here, and we do have the interdisciplinary dialogue coming just after our next speaker. So if we can just move on to Dr. Alicia Huero, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone come together and see what kind of dialogue ensues.
Me too.